Welcome to the last DCH masterclass of the year. We are very grateful to have your participation in this event today. My name is Carla Sofia, and today I'm gonna be your host. So, in this occasion, we are making this webinar in collaboration with MCE, Management Center Europe. MCE is like one of the largest providers of training programs and in-company training. In this occasion, we'll have the participation of Andreas Benkowitz that's gonna talk about new ways of collaboration. He's like really expertise in this topic, so he's gonna share with us his experience. I would like to introduce Monica Arquero, that she's the Senior Associate of MCE, to give us like a brief presentation of Andreas. Hi, Monica.
Hi to everyone. Could you hear me?
Yes.
I hope so. Fine. Welcome to everyone to this masterclass, like Carla says. So let me introduce my colleague, Andreas Benkowitz, okay? Andreas brings 15 years of international corporate experience with Microsoft and 10 years of consultancy and training in a variety industries. He helps senior managers and their teams to initiate and implement required transformation. A senior associate at MCE, Andreas delivers business and human resources programs. He specializes in the management of changes and transformation, communication and engagement, leadership development and coaching, agility, and much more competencies. So let me ask him to precise a little bit more about his experience and why we thought that new ways of collaboration could be a very interesting topic for this last masterclass of the year. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks you both, to you, Carla and Monica, and good afternoon to all of you, and thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you about this topic that I truly care about. New ways of collaboration is about a more productive, more holistic, more human, and simply put, a better way of getting work done. Perhaps, a couple of words about myself. I'm a psychologist by background, so that's sort of that's you should know, and then worked for a number of consulting firms, then almost 15 years in Microsoft. In my last role, was responsible for everything that had to do with change, talent management, talent development internationally, so the global role there. Left the organization some 10 years ago to start my own business. And one of the topics I really care about is new ways of collaboration. And what I would like to do in the next 30 to 40 minutes, I guess, is to walk you through this topic basically in 3 steps. In step 1, I want to talk about the why. So why is this new way of collaboration actually a topic we should think about? Yeah. And secondly, then talk a bit about the what. What do new ways of collaboration look like? So very practical. So what are some of the elements? What are some of the facets? And then really the how. So how can we approach the implementation of new ways of collaboration? So I'm going to bring a number of examples, some companies I've worked with. Obviously, we have some time limitation here, so I cannot go into the detail. But definitely, I'm going to talk about that. And if later on, if you have any specific questions in that respect, obviously, happy to answer those. So I want to give you the big picture as well, because I think it's important to put that into perspective. But definitely, we go into real examples and the concepts that are required to make new ways of collaboration work. So idea, and I hope is that I can inspire you a little bit to move and think a little bit into this direction. So let's start and look a little bit into setting the scene for this, and the stage for new ways of collaboration, and answer the question, why do we need new ways of collaboration in the first place? And obviously there's a number of things happening, and the world is changing, that's for sure. And it's almost it's almost like not required to talk about it, but COVID obviously is a big threat. At the same time, it also opens an incredible space and incredible opportunities for doing things differently. And at the same time, it is only an accelerator and a trigger. It speeds up a process, that has been underway for quite some years. We are seeing this especially in the virtualization of work and this whole notion of working from home, especially for knowledge worker. It is not new at all. When I think about my own career, I actually moved offices for Microsoft. I used to work in Munich, Germany, and then moved up to Hamburg, actually in the north of Germany. Microsoft doesn't have any office here. And that was in 2000, and I started to working from home. So obviously I was traveling quite a bit because I had an international team. But when I was not traveling, I was actually working from home. So, and I'm just one example. So this is not new. The technology has been there for 20 plus years, but obviously Corona accelerated the process significantly. And it also shows the limitation of work has been organized so far. That there are many more opportunities that exist. And if we are willing to open up to new ideas. So that's one, that's the pandemic. The second one, and this is where psychology starts to come in, is especially social neuroscience. Now, what we need to know, or what we know is, we know much better how our brains work. Over the last 10 plus years, we have learned so much about how our brains work and what conditions are required to make it productive and what hinders it. And this is obviously highly relevant when we are thinking about collaboration. Which conditions can we create to make work productive and also fun? Because emotions obviously play a very critical role in this respect. So number two, neuroscience, so new knowledge about this. The third one, I think it's a common one by now, and everyone agrees to that, is this whole trend towards knowledge work. Yeah? Less and less work is just this, thoughtless, monotone work. Basically, all work we're doing today, all we're seeing requires some level of cognitive skills. It requires that our brains work. And this is, not just the typical knowledge worker, so to speak, but you can see this in production lines. Yeah, collaboration with robots, etc., requires people's brains. Yeah, so even the work that used to be very monotonous work, very simple work, where you'd say, oh, you don't need much of your brain power for this, it is becoming more knowledge work. Yeah, so you will want to use people's brain. And then, last but not least, the fourth reason, obviously, VUCA. Yeah, and again, Corona is just one example. We don't know what's next. Yeah? If you look back, it's always in hindsight. Yeah, you say, could have known this, but not true. Yeah. If the last year hasn't made that clear, what would have? The world is becoming even more volatile. It is becoming more uncertain. It's becoming more complex and more ambiguous. And that definitely requires new approaches. Yeah, we cannot resolve the same, use the same solutions and to solve new problems. So we definitely need new ways of collaboration. So what I would like to start with is, just a little bit about the human brain, perhaps, because, obviously, this is the starting point in many respects. When you think about, we just want you to make an estimate maybe for yourself for a minute. When you think about how many logical operations your brain does in any second, what would you guess? So write it down, maybe. I'll give you a few seconds, what it is. Now the short answer to this is 1,000 trillion. So that's a 1 with 15 zeros. Yeah, so that's a long number. And the question is, sort of, why would anyone need that huge amount of logical operations? And the answer is, we need this for two reasons mainly. The first one is to make predictions. What our brains do is not as much, collecting information, but actually predicting what's going to happen next, and then we see what's happening, and then we make the connections. Yeah, that's hugely important because the brain at the beginning is pretty much an empty box. Emotions are made. The second one, and that is really critical when we talk about new ways of collaboration, our brains are made for relationships. One of the things that distinguishes human brains from other mammals is that our brains are not programmed when it comes to communication collaboration. So we need to learn this. Yeah, and in vice versa, this also means that our brains need this. Yeah. For our brains to function well, we need other people. We need relationships with other people. Yeah? Innovation happens between people, not in people. Yeah, that's very important. Now, there's a huge capability, obviously. So you have 1,000 trillion operations per second, which is, just incredible. But that also means that there's plenty of skills, thoughts, ideas available. So much potential to really tap into. And as we just saw with regards to the why, it's also needed. We need these capabilities. Yeah? So the question is, what is required to tap into these resources? And when you think about that and look into this, it's basically 4 factors that really make human brains effective. And when you think about that and say, oh, if these are the 4 factors, then what do I need to do in order to make best use of people's brains? Then I need to create the conditions for that. And basically, it is 4 factors that really create or allow for human brains to be effective. The first one is fearlessness. And I guess we've known this for many years. If we are afraid of something, our mental capabilities shrink significantly immediately. Yeah. Then it's all about fight or flight. It's a very physical reaction. Our brain focuses only on this. It's a question of survival. So what you want is that, for your brain and other people's brain to break best, you really need to create an environment of fearlessness. And there's an issue when you start thinking about collaboration, because hierarchy actually creates fear. You can show this. Yeah. So you have to think about when you have a hierarchical organization and at the same time you want fearlessness. Well, there's some issues at hand, first of all, and then secondly, even if you have that and you believe you have to have hierarchy in organization, maybe you have to. How do you sort of create that hierarchy? How to position it? And we're going to talk more about that. The second element you really want to make sure is happening is positive emotion. Again, from a psychological perspective, we've known this for quite some years. Positive emotion is an incredibly important precondition for learning. Yeah? Our brain is much better able to establish new neural connections when it's in a positive mood, basically. Yeah, when positive emotions are around, when the world is fun, when it's exciting, and the new world is all about learning new things. So when you think back of, I was talking about the why, it's all about new things. It's about finding new approaches. It's about innovation. It's about creativity. So again, we need to create that environment for positive emotion so that people can learn and, we create better places. Now, the third one is the most interesting one from my perspective, because first of all, it's relatively new that we know this. And secondly, when you look at our workplaces today and start, talking about relationships between people, etc., it starts to get interesting, because sometimes people say, yeah, in the workplace, how do we do this, etc. But the issue is our brains need this. Yeah, so we have to think about how to make this work. And I'll come back with some examples on what can be done in this area. And then the last one, really, when you think about, how can you create the best conditions, is purpose. Our brains are, totally pattern detecting devices. Yeah, so if there's a pattern somewhere, we immediately see it. I could show you some examples here. We don't have the time. If we had more interaction, I would be happy to do this. But you can certainly show that our brains actually create even patterns where there aren't any. Yeah, so because we need this for learning, you cannot learn something where you don't have a pattern. Then becomes random information. So our brain each time constructs something so that it can remember it. And the same is true for purpose. So our brain requires purpose. It asks for it. So why am I doing this? What is the meaning behind it? Yeah. So as you're thinking about, structuring work, think about how you best organize things. It's really quite a bit about purpose. It's quite about meaning. Yeah. So you have to create these 4 conditions. If you really want to use your brain and other people's brain, fearlessness, positive emotion, relationships, and purpose. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about, how this can be achieved. So we know that these are the 4 factors. Let's look a little bit into, how we can best make this work. So as we talk about fearlessness, a couple of things come to mind. One of the most important concepts, and it is a concept, but it's a really research and it's been put in place extensively, is this whole idea of the fearless organization. Now, as I mentioned earlier, hierarchy definitely, the fear that it creates when it's not handled well in particular, reduces psychological safety. And Google is a great example. They've done a lot of studies around this and looked into, so what distinguishes very effective teams from very ineffective teams with their project Aristotle. And interestingly enough, what they found is a concept that, again, we've known since the 90s of the last century, which is psychologically safety actually makes the difference between very productive teams and less productive teams. Yeah? And they also found that particularly people who are lower in status hierarchy experience stress in the presence of those with higher status. Now we know that stress and fear actually reduces brain power. Yeah? So we have to think about how can we create conditions that actually reduce fear, as much as we can, if we really want to use people's brain. Yeah? So the most important element here is to reframe failure, because failure is all about learning and making mistakes. That's a huge one in this one. I'm going to talk more about this in a minute. And that's obviously particularly relevant in this VUCA world, where you have uncertainty, interdependence, and what all is at stake. So it's very important to think about, how can you create an organization that ideally is fearless, or at least reduce the level of fear, of anxiety as much as you can. The second element really is this whole idea of positive emotion. So again, we said that's particularly relevant for learning, and again to make people's brains work best, if you will. Obviously, there's a lot of things happening when you think about new work, which is all connected to nice offices, coffee corners, areas where people can relax, etc., etc. Now, I guess with Corona, I think one of the things you will see happening is you're going to have even less office space, and I think what is going to happen, we see that already, is that office space becomes more like rooms to meet and build relationships. It's going to be less about individual offices. If you want to do individual work, I think people have learned by now that they can do this from home. But there's a relationship component, working with others. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But the relationship bit, that's going to make the difference. So new work is certainly one to create an environment where you have positive emotion in the office space. It's just nice. You come there. It's fun to be there. You go there because you like to go there. It's not these dark rooms you might have known in the past. The second element when it comes to growth, to positive emotion, is actually this whole idea of a growth mindset. And I'm sure some of you have heard about this. It's a big thing at Microsoft these days. The new CEO, Satya Nadella, has introduced that big time. And the idea here is to actually create a mindset that is all about learning, and learning about collectively and individually. And the idea is that it's a certain attitude towards people as well, where you think about others and create a space for learning, and to understand our capabilities and develop those. So it's really focusing on what can we learn, what can we do in addition. So it's a very strength-based approach as well. So it's not about what have you done wrong, or is there anything you have to compensate for because you have a weakness here, but it's all about what can we learn collectively and individually. The third one, and I think that's really, as I mentioned earlier, is in a way the most interesting one from my perspective, or very interesting one at least, is this whole idea of relationships. So what can you do in organizations to create good relationships? Because again, our brains need that, and if we want to make people's brains, which we need, most effective, then we have to create these relationships. And it's interesting because at some level this seems to be missing. It's not something that comes to mind easily, and many companies I know of at least, that idea of creating relationships, good working relationships, is a bit awkward. Particularly when I think of older companies where particularly senior leaders really want to have a distance between themselves so that they don't talk about their private life. So it's just about, business, business, business. But, so we think it's all about ratio, etc. And it's not about emotions, and it's not about feelings, etc. I was actually talking to an HR leader this morning from a very engineering culture kind of company, and for them, they realize that's actually on the agenda because you cannot move forward with this. It's becoming more about relationship, and again, Corona helps with this because when you talk to people these days, again, not sure what your reality is, but when I talk to people, what I hear, what people miss the most is their colleagues, and in a virtual environment, you can only do this so much. You cannot really compensate for that. So it is about working relationships. It's about good relationships, and it's about a holistic approach. It's a little bit of a tough issue, but on some level, we actually have been tackling this also from an HR side. I mean, we talked about emotional intelligence. We talked about the empathetic leader, social skills, etc., work-life balance, maybe. Yeah, but what it really is creating spaces for what our brain needs, which is positive contact with other people. So we have practiced this many times, sometimes by chance, having a business dinner, informal beer, etc. But this actually goes beyond that because video conferences are definitely showing, some of the stuff that's happening, but there's more to come. And then last but not least, and again, I think that's becoming more of a mainstream over the last couple of years, is this notion of purpose. More and more organizations are moving towards purpose-driven organizations, what they call it, and really making the connection between people's own, private, personal purpose and the organizational one. So what is the contribution of our company to society? It's much broader than making profit. And as I said, our brains are longing for meaning. So this is where the contribution kicks in. And what purpose does, it makes collaboration easier, and it especially enables higher speed. And again, that's a requirement in the VUCA world, a much higher speed of decision making. You create basically a North Star, and then if you allow people to make decisions, totally new things are possible. So it all comes together in a way, and it all fits together. So let me talk a little bit about some examples here from companies I've been working with. I'm sure you also have some examples, but let me share a few companies who sort of started to work on this. The first one here, I divided it here between sort of leadership on one hand side, because that's one big lever you have. You can look at it from an organizational perspective. And last but not least, I think I'm talking to an HR community here. So what can you do from an HR perspective? So I want to cover each of these three and give you a few examples, from my experience, from my background on what this means. So the first one really is about leadership. And what I've seen is, just an example here was an IT department of a global company. So the IT department itself had about 800 employees. And they started to talk about servant leadership because the issue they had was speed. Yeah? So they were way too slow, as many IT departments used to be in the past, very kind of waterfall kind of approach, 5 years planning cycle, and then you push this out. So they started to talk about two things. One is, really the servant leader, and, start thinking about how can we drive this. And the starting point for them was actually with the CEO and his team. So we had a longer process where we talked about, generating trust in the team. We talked about decision-making processes, and they made significant changes there, empowering their people on a large extent. Yeah, so really driving purpose deeper into the organization, and with that, actually allowing people to make decisions much, much faster. One example. Another example, particularly when we talk about here about establishing purpose. I was working with a smaller pharma company recently on their purpose statement and see, what does this mean? And that's a 150-year-old company, and they are looking for new leadership. They need to look for new ways of collaboration because their market is limited, and they need to think about how can they make better use of the opportunities they have, because I'm sure they have some. Yeah, so we started with the purpose. We developed that together with many members of the organization, and now they're using this for decision making. They're using it for development of their leaders, for the development of their employees. So very, very powerful. Another example, so I'm also showing you different scales. Yeah, so large company, so this IT department here, 800 employees for a 60,000 people company. The pharma company is about 200 people. And I'm also working with a startup, which is big fun at the moment for me, which just started with 6 employees. They hope to be about 3,000 in 2 years' time, and that's very realistic in the business they're in. And also there, we started with purpose, because the purpose then helped to start thinking about what does this look like in the decision-making process they want to use. How can they again make sure that they can that people in their specific shops can make very quick decisions without going back, because they believe that they are much better positioned to make this decision. We talked about attitude and the approach to leadership overall, and specific decision-making processes. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second, because you definitely need some tools if you're going into this direction to make this work. Yeah. And they also introduce basically a networking organization. So for learning and practice sharing, they establish intentionally networks between these very geographically dispersed people to create this. So actually they actually look for that, if you will, growth mindset by establishing, actually fostering it by creating this intentionally. So allow time for that, they drive this forward. Another one, when you talk more about organizational structure, so the first one was more about leadership and how you drive things, is this organizational approach. So working with an insurance company recently, and they were looking into this whole idea of Holacracy, which is around implementing self-managed teams. So it's all a team approach. So you don't have a leader as such with decision-making power, but people are empowered to make their decisions, and then it's all about roles and who has what role, and implement that. Very powerful, and definitely does away with with fear. It creates positive emotion quite a bit, because it becomes about learning. A big part on purpose there, and then relationship building. Same thing or similar with a software company I've worked with, more into going into self-managed, self-organized teams, and sort of driving this forward. Now, from a HR perspective, I also put a few things here. So, what does this mean for HR? Yeah. So, for our profession, what can we do? And what I've seen as HR leaders do is, one, to establish networks. So, here in this particular instance, it was about learning. So they implemented self-managed learning networks that basically gave people the space to meet and resources to meet and learn from each other, get people in to actually drive this forward. Then I guess a big opportunity for HR here is in this whole notion of driving culture change. And I guess we've been doing this for quite a while, but it's definitely all about creating this fearlessness organization with design, a different organization design potentially, and particularly to increase and speed up decision making. That's what it's saying. Yeah. And then this whole idea of creating networks. How can you create these relationships? I think that's a big task for HR, where they can do something to make this work. Growth mindset, I talked quite a bit about this already, and really help push also senior leadership towards this purpose-driven kind of approach. Sometimes leaders feel like, I know the purpose of this organization, everyone should know it. My experience is, as I just mentioned, with this pharma company, but also with the startup, that's actually not true necessarily. Yeah, so they don't necessarily know what the purpose is and how we can sort of push this forward. So some examples, happy to give you a few more if we have the time. So what does this mean? So what does this take, if you will, to implement this? I think there's four things, from my perspective, to get this into motion. First of all, I think it's critical to understand that this is a journey. None of the companies I've talked to, I've worked with, are there yet. You know, what they did is they started to sail. They definitely saw some benefits, but they also, you know, had to redefine the destinations basically as they move forward. So, you know, when you think about embarking that ship, if you will, it's definitely a journey you take on. Now, it definitely means there's work to do, and the circumstances we have to create are very different. So the first thing we have to do is to create that right environment. And I'm going to talk in a minute about some tools. The second one is really about an attitude towards human beings. If your leaders believe that people as such are rather lazy people who don't want to use their brains and, you know, can't get excited or don't be engaged, etc., then, you know, moving towards this definitely is the wrong thing to do. What you need here is a very almost, sometimes people say, you know, it's a bit idealistic, but again, you know, what I've seen in my experience, sure, there's a few people, you know, who ultimately will be lazy, but the question is, what do you get out of the 95% for whom you make that life much better and who are going to be much more productive? Yeah. So are you willing to take that leap of faith, if you will, to go there? So I think that's the second one. So this whole idea about an attitude towards that. The third one, and you know, cannot emphasize that enough, what you definitely need is skilled leaders. It's not easy to, you know, not rule by hierarchy anymore. It's not easy to say, you make that decision because I believe you as an individual or you as a person, you're closer to the customer, you're closer to our clients, whatever. You can make that decision because you're in a much better position. That takes some skill and that takes some attitude. And it's not easy to do this because what you do here as a leader, you move much more into a coaching role. You're moving much more into a questioning role versus a reviewing role and a driving role. So again, very much about the growth mindset. And last but not least, it's actually very much about skilled people, people who actually want to use their brain and act as adults with a high level of social skills. I was just mentioning this IT department. Now, when we started to work on this and said, well, you know, we want you to make these decisions, we empower you. You know, what can you do? What do you want to do differently? There were some people who didn't want to go that route. So that's also one thing to be aware of. If you decide to move this route, this is not for everyone. Yeah, so you might find some people who say, I check in my brain in the morning and you tell me what to do. And then in the evening, I'll get it back at checkout and then I will do whatever is required. But I don't want to, you know, think about that this way. Yeah? So definitely something to consider. It's not just like, you know, you just do this. Some tools, you know, that I learned are actually required to do this. A few. The first one, and I think, you know, talk quite a bit about this already, is around decision making. So how do you make decisions in the new forms of collaboration, particularly when you start driving decision making deeper into the organization? And where I've seen many organizations fail is when they do decision making, you know, like in a democratic fashion or, you know, in a consensus fashion, because that's going to be like endless conversations. So one of the things I've seen working quite well is this whole idea of consent decision making. Maybe just in a nutshell, you know, I don't have the time to talk about this for like 15 minutes and explain in great detail, but just briefly, basically what it means is that, you know, if you want to make a decision in a team, basically what you do is you bring a proposal. And then the process looks like, so is there any objection? Is there any good reason to not make that decision in this way? And then you have a conversation on, okay, and if there's any objections that seem to be relevant, then you try to integrate those and to basically build on each other. And that speeds up the process tremendously. And it's not looking at, you know, what can go wrong, but it's some risk taking and at the same time, some checking on how can we build. So it's very much, again, in the lines of learning and moving things forward. The second bit, what I see is very important for teams is that they get some mechanism on how to deal with conflict. If you go this route into new ways of collaboration, and I see, you know, people struggling with that, I see companies struggling with this, you have to have some methodology and some tools and some skills on how to deal with conflict, because conflict will come up. And if it's sort of, put under the carpet, it's not going to fly, because then, obviously emotions rise within people, and over a couple of years at the latest, people will go back to the old behaviors. So you have to help them to deal with conflict in a very constructive manner, in a very adult kind of fashion, as I mentioned earlier on the previous slide. So definitely something to think about and invest in if you really want to go that route. The third one is meeting facilitation. Again, if you go that route, and I see so much waste in this area, where people are not capable of facilitating meeting in a productive way, another big potentially hole people can fall into, and I've seen that. Yeah, so that it's meeting. It's very unproductive, simply because people don't know. Yeah, they don't know how and to do it. Mindfulness. What I mean by that is, you definitely need that as a leader in this kind of organization. So very much focused on, how do you deal with your own emotions, but definitely also something for employees in the organization, for other people. Office space, talked quite a bit about this already. So this whole idea of, having really what I would call, coming together spaces more than anything. Yeah. Spaces for coming together, individual work can be done from home. So you have to recreate your offices in a way. And I think there's opportunity, because you're going to have so much more space. I was talking to the company a couple of months back, and they changed their office space completely. And in the beginning, they thought, oh, we will have too little space, et cetera, et cetera. Now, COVID aside, but even before COVID, they had the situation that when they started to reconstruct this, there was actually more space, because people were not coming, to the office for each and every meeting. They try to work from home, and when they were coming into the meeting, into the offices, it was much more about working together collaboratively. It was about relationship building, etc. And the last one, obviously, and I think we've become, all of us, or most of us, have become very fluent in this by now, is this virtual collaboration and socializing. Yeah, what can you do to work better together in a collaborative fashion in that virtual environment? I see many examples here, where people have, even lunch together in the virtual setting. They have a beer in the evening together in a virtual setting. Now, it's not the same as, sitting next to each other, but there's opportunity. Yeah. And there are some tools you can use to actually implement this. Yeah. So again, just some tools. We're a bit short on time. Definitely, there's more to talk about here to look into this. But some ideas on how to make this real, and some practices really that I've seen working in this space. Some tips. So when you intend to go that route, here comes my little short list of tips. The first one really is to really look at it from a work perspective. Yeah, how can you best get work done? So I would never implement, something like self-managed teams or less hierarchy in organization just for the sake of it. It's nice, it's a maybe philosophically or psychologically a good idea to do this, but you have to have an environment where people believe that this is an opportunity to get work done in a better way, so that they're willing to give it a try. So really connect it to something that's real. So where there's an issue, where it's like, decision making is too slow, or like in the IT department I was just talking about, where definitely they were just too slow to deliver to the needs of the organization. That's your starting point. That's your ignition point where you can say, oh, maybe start thinking about something new and put something into perspective. Number two, if you get, you need to get work done. So again, don't start in a vacuum. If there's a business problem, you can use this approach to start, to move into this. Third one, start with the individual. Many times, it is the leader, one leader, that really feels like have to change this, and then you can get going. And we talk quite a bit about the change in attitude and mindset, and that's really what it takes. And that you cannot do this with like 200 people at the same time. Start with the individual. Start with what needs to change from an attitude perspective in terms of, being an adult, stand in for your own opinions, be willing to take accountability, etc. And then finally, you really need to bring people together to create the solution. Yeah? So even if you as a leader say, oh, or a leader you're working with says, I want to go that route, you have to bring the team together to actually create the solution, because there is not one fit all kind of solution. I showed you some tools, and I know that you need some of those tools in one way or another to create the solution, but people need to create ultimately that transparency, that environment, and they need to be participating in that. Not only because, then they identify themselves more with it, but also because the solution will simply be better. You could not envision the solutions people come up with at times before you actually started the process. And sometimes very, very surprised. Yeah. So these are my 4 tips as we're thinking about this. So to sum it up, that was the why, the what, and the how of new ways of collaboration. I hope you enjoyed this. I certainly have enjoyed it. And now if there's any questions, happy to answer these. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andreas.
Thank you so much, Andreas. It was quite interesting. I hope that the participant or the listeners could enjoy it also. So let's see if there are some questions. I leave it to you, Carla.
Okay. Okay, good. We got one question of the public that someone is asking: how can you make your employees collaborate more?
Yeah. Well, yeah, the question is, so when you say collaborate more, I guess you are talking about how you bring them together, how to motivate them to do this, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah,
like
I think
kind of having more confidence.
Make them more confident to collaborate?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things, I guess we talked about earlier. One is really this whole idea of skill building. I mean, it definitely has something to do with this. Usually people don't, or the question is this a skill question? I should rephrase that perhaps. So is that a skill question, or is it a motivational question? Yeah. Or is this even a fear kind of question? Yeah. And many times it's a combination of these 3 things. So one is, definitely create a little bit of that fearlessness organization. I think that's very important. So allow for mistakes. Make sure that you're transparent as a leader in particular as you do this, because that creates this whole idea of, yeah, if people are transparent about mistakes, then I myself can actually start doing it. So it's very much about role modeling. I was just talking about this CIO of this 800 people IT organization. One of the biggest, and I will always remember that moment. He was like, he was sharing a project and some work he had done recently, and then he said, I really screwed up. And you could see that the leadership team like, what is he talking about? But that was a very important moment, because basically he showed to them his own vulnerability, and he also demonstrated that he's really it's okay to make mistakes, right? So I'm making mistakes as a leader, you can make mistakes, that's all fine. It's a question, how do we deal with this afterwards? And that brings people together, because then, I don't have to be afraid that if I'm working with person X, Y, that, I don't have to do this. So that's one part of the answer. I think the other part of the answer is, very practically, bring them together either around work. So if there's certain projects that are relevant where you want to bring them together, where you want to use their brains, I think that's one opportunity. And the second big one is what I showed you in terms of these learning networks. So that means bring them together around learning. Yeah. So if there's certain topics that people might be interested in, this is where you can bring them together, because then they share some excitement, some curiosity, and then collaboration falls into place.
Okay, thank you so much for your answer. I have one more. It said, do you think that technology can affect the way of new collaborations?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're seeing this already. Obviously, and you see that on many, many levels. The most obvious one is this whole thing of virtual collaboration. I mean, just having this seminar here, this masterclass, you know, I'm not sure, you know, a year ago you would have done this, right? You most likely we would be sitting in a large conference room, and you know, I would give the talk from a podium, and you know, you would be sitting there, and we would have that conversation. So I think technology plays a big role, and there's so much opportunity, and so there was a big leapfrog also, you know, for people using it. So I think there's one element. I think that again, the biggest shortcoming is the relationship piece, and that's what you're experiencing right now. And we haven't figured that out from a technology side. So that's one element. The second element is, you know, also what I mentioned at the beginning. I think it's becoming much broader. We see this virtual thing right now, but obviously this whole idea of robotics, artificial intelligence, etc., are also big fields that will change the workplace significantly. And each of these, and I haven't talked about AI at all, artificial intelligence, that's also a huge driver towards new ways of collaboration, because this is where, you know, the way people work today, I mean, in 20 years from now, definitely will be different. And one is AI, another big one is robotics. You know, on the production side, it's going to be huge. Yeah. And again, I think this is where, when you think about it, you know, you have to create these new ways of collaboration today, because you can speed up decision making intensely. Yeah. And if information is available, your people are not stupid. Yeah. So usually one of the reasons we used to have hierarchy in organizations is that you had certain information that was only accessible by a few people. And since the distribution of information was difficult, you had to go that route. Yeah, you couldn't tell everyone what was going on. That's not an issue anymore. Yeah, you can communicate information and make information accessible to everyone in your organization, like, you know, in no time, basically. And then they are there with their customers, with their clients on the production line, and they can make decisions. And they can make much better decisions if we allow them to, than any manager can, yeah, because they're closer to the action.
I totally agree with your response. I don't have any more questions. I don't know if you have any, Monica, that you wanted to ask.
Okay, Andreas, you talk about new ways of collaboration. I think that as human resources director, this is always a big issue to find the correct way of doing, and you tend to ask to your employees how they would like to involve or the company inside those decisions. But if we take some example like companies like Google or these technology companies that are in San Francisco and so on, do you have some example that shows it's completely different, their approach of new ways of collaboration than the one we use or we tend to use here in Europe?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily a Europe or a US thing. Definitely not. You see a lot of work done here in Europe, particularly in this area where they're actually ahead of the US. It's always curious because, you know, what I see many times is that, you know, there's this, you know, fad coming over, and it's like, oh, this big thing. As I mentioned with the Fearless organization, I mean, this has been a concept that's been developed in Europe in the 90s. Yeah. And then, you know, by chance, Google picks it up, and then it becomes a big thing out of a sudden. Yeah? And at the same time, there's a number of companies back here in Europe who have been working with these kind of concepts for many years. Yeah, it's just like, so I don't think it's a US or Europe thing. I think that's something that's, you know, just if you look what's happening on the neuroscience side, on the psychology side, on the leadership development side, sort of coming together, and it's happening in very parallel senses. In Germany, for example, there's a drugstore company actually who are implementing self-managed teams. So all these teams are very independent, and they do what is the right thing to do for their shops. Yeah, and they don't talk about it much. They just do it. Yeah, it's not this big Google thing and, you know, Project Aristotle. They just put it in place, and it's working, and it's very effective. And when you talk about, you know, customer intimacy, you know, and customer satisfaction on one hand side, and when you look into attrition rates of these companies, no one is leaving. Yeah, no one is leaving because it's a good working environment. People can learn, they can thrive, And you might say, working in a drugstore, yeah, still, you know, it makes a difference. Yeah.
So
I
you
don't
said
think
it. Okay,
yeah.
so you said that it's not a question of continent, okay, of
No.
areas, but maybe it's a question of sectors, or not.
Well, I think, you know, I think in some areas it looks as if it's easier to implement. So, you know, I was mentioning the startup I'm working with, and you know, it's kind of interesting. We the CEO basically of the startup, you know, but still, you know, the leader of that you know, small startup. Originally, he was very much, you know, coming very much from a perspective of, yeah, let's do this. You know, that's what I want to try. You know, I want to try something new. I don't want to just come with new product. I also want a new organizational approach. And then we had some people coming in and saying, you know, is that really true? I think it's more about attitude of the leaders, because this is also a very production-oriented kind of thing. Yeah, so this is not Google. Yeah, this is not software developers. This is not people, you know, with PhDs. Yeah, that's people who, I don't know, you know, in some instances, you know, they're refugees coming from Syria or somewhere and doing this work. And it's just nothing to do with that. I don't think it's a question of sector. It's not a question of, you know,
Countries,
geography or anything like this. I think it's more a question of geography. And again, you know, if it makes sense. Yeah. So if you can figure out what's the problem you're trying to solve, and then you can start applying that.
and sometimes I have also in mind that maybe the culture could be also or make the difference.
Yeah.
The culture
You're
of
talking
the
company
country.
culture or country culture?
No,
Yeah.
both things. Both things.
Yeah, it is definitely. I mean, that's true. Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, let me just go back to this. Maybe if I can just go back to this slide. You know, I was talking here about, you know, skilled people, adult social skills, and that's culture. Yeah, because what you have to have here is like this. Yeah, this willingness to take responsibility for yourself and accountability for yourself. And definitely there's cultures where you have more hierarchy as such, and there's countries where you have less, right?
Yes.
But at the same time, yeah, but that's true. And at the same time, I'm sure that there's enough people you can find if you start something with something like this, you know, they can, you know, move forward and drive this. If the leaders want to do this, what I've seen again and again, this is all about leadership. Yeah, you know, obviously, you know, if an employee in this drugstore would say, you know, let's do self-managed teams, and the leader feels like, you know, no, I don't want to do a hierarchy. I mean, there's nothing he or she can do, right? But if the leader says, you know, that's the route I want to go, and I've seen this in this insurance company where the leader said, you know, I want to do this differently because I know that we're not using our potential, we're not using our capabilities, then you can start. And it's a journey. Yeah? Then you need those tools, and you need some time. And you know, in this startup, obviously, there's the opportunity to hire the right people from early on because there's people there. Your pool might be smaller in some countries than in others. You might need to work more on the mindset in some countries than in others. But I mean, the psychology behind that is identical. There's no difference.
Yeah. Yes, of course. We are human, so
yes, exactly.
Not yet the robotics.
No,
yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
We have one more, and I think it's gonna be the last one because we're getting out of time. And it says, what kind of education or training should team members and team leaders take in order to mature those collaboration skills?
To measure those collaboration skills, or to make sure that, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. But I think the biggest one, you know, some of those, I think these are the most important processes and tools you need. Yeah. So I think you need to, and this is not necessarily, well, there's a training component here because, you know, some of it is simply, I don't know what I don't know. Yeah. So when you think about decision making, there is some very good practices, and you can teach these practices. It's not very complicated, but then it's all about practicing it. Yeah. And this consent is a key one for me because you have to find you know, decisions have to be made in the team. And if it's not made by, if these decisions are not made by the hierarchy, then you have to still find a mechanism. So you have to teach people how to do it, and you have to practice it. Yeah? So that's one. The second one, again, for me, a very important one is this conflict resolution thing. If we have conflict in the team, or if we have, with whoever, they have to have meaningful or helpful tools at hand on how to deal with that conflict on a very adult level. Yeah. So these are the two for me that are really, that you need that just from a foundational perspective. The other one, meeting facilitation, virtual collaboration, that's sort of, advanced a little bit, even though I think meeting facilitation is also very critical, because you just screw up so much time, or you waste so much time. But the first two, decision making and dealing with conflict, are really important.
Thank you so much for your answer.
Thank you.
And I think we are done for today's session. I'm very grateful with you both, Monica and Andreas, for your collaboration today. And it's a pleasure. And this is a really good way to close the year with this last masterclass.
Great.
Thanks a lot, Carla.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Yeah.
Bye to everyone.